very much indeed, Sandy. I really appreciate the invitation, and to you as well, Ellen. Um, so the first part of it, as you say, Sandy, I'm going to do two interventions. The first one, I'm going to explain the project that Sandy had been mentioning, this deep institutional innovation project that I'm working on. And then in the second part, we'll talk a little bit about the myth, the idea of the transformation to sustainability as being not simply a technological transformation, which is what the main narrative of it is at the moment, but also potentially a transformation of the myths that we live by. So that part of it, the myth part of it, we'll get to in the second half. So in this first part, I'm going to give you a little background on the project, this deep institutional innovation, and what we mean by that, and what we're doing in that. So it builds on the book that I'd written on disordered minds. As Sandy was saying, disordered mind was really sparked in a way by growing up in Northern Ireland, which I did, in a context of violence. And my own personal experience being that not everyone was the same when it came to their propensity for engaging in violence. There was a minority who were much more enthusiastic about it than the majority. And indeed, within the majority, there was a large number who were totally opposed to the violence that was happening. So that's, if you like, the roots back in childhood for the book that I eventually wrote in Disordered Minds. And as Sandy says, it was about looking at a number of occasions in the 20th century where very dangerous leaders came to power. And the four that I was looking at were Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot in Cambodia. And looking at, were there commonalities in terms of the personalities, in terms of the context that they arose within, in terms of how they rose to power, the support that they had, and so forth. So that was really the focus of that book. It happened, the book was published in 2018, and so Donald Trump was hardly mentioned in it. There's a couple of references to him towards the end, because Trump was just emerging at that stage. But there was a lot that was happening with Trump in terms of a replaying of a lot of the themes that had happened with these other dangerous leaders, in terms of the emergence of Trump's personality as well, in fact, but also in terms of the support that he was gathering, the underpinning threat of violence that there was, and so forth. So there was a book that came out at that time with Trump's election, which Bandy Lee, who's a colleague in the United States, Bandy was the editor of it, and it was called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 37 mental health professionals warn about the danger of Donald Trump. And just by history repeating itself, yesterday there was, Bandy led a conference in Washington, The More Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which is again all of the authors, including myself, writing again, warning about the danger of Donald Trump to get back into power again in the United States. But part of the discussion around that first book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, people were thinking, how do we stop these people from getting into power? And one of the things that was mentioned was psychological tests for people who were standing for office. And to me, that sounded like it just wasn't going to work. The problems were much more deep-seated than simply the individual, and couldn't be solved simply by having mental health checks for someone who was standing for office. And so that was part of the genesis of this deep institutional innovation project. This conviction that the reason that these dangerous individuals get into power is deeply rooted in the types of social institutions that we live by and live within. And just to describe briefly what I mean by social institution, in the project, we look at 6 of them. So we have politics, economics, technology, religion, gender, and education. So in each of these areas, they're social institutions, not just in the way, if you take, for example, economics, we're not just thinking about the institutions of banks and lending and so forth. It's not just the physical institutions, it's the norms and values, the practices that underpin So it's this holistic view of social institution as being so this wider sense of certainly the institutions themselves, but also the norms, practices, values, and so on. And so in the project, when we started, there were a number of premises that we sort of put forward as to this was the basis on which we were going to start understanding and working on this project. And I'm working within UCC within a group that's mostly focused on sustainability, so mostly focused on climate change. So many of the group that I work with, for example, are engineers who do modeling of the types of technology that's needed to get Ireland to the climate neutrality. So we need how many electric vehicles we need, how much wind power we need, and so forth. So it was an engineering group, a technology group that I joined, and that this project began within. But it very quickly sort of came to, and as I say, one of the premises of the project is that we couldn't just look at climate change as an isolated problem. Climate change is an extremely serious problem, obviously, but it's also only one of what has come to be termed the polycrisis, that there are multiple crises that are happening simultaneously. So climate change is one, the environmental crisis, ecological crisis in terms of species extinction, hugely increasing levels of inequality that are destabilizing societies, increasing violence and warfare. So these problems, as I say, these crises are deeply interlinked. So that was one of the premises of the project. We can't just take climate change out, look for individual solutions for that one crisis, because the roots of all of these individual crises are deeply interlinked. And so that was one of the premises of the project, is they're deeply interlinked in the structures of the social institutions that make up society. So we're looking then in terms of looking at the structures of politics, economics, technology, religion, gender, and education, as I say, and digging deep into what are the commonalities in terms of particularly in terms of values, particularly in terms of the rules that we live by, and looking for how each of these social institutions need to change in order to bring us towards not just sustainability, which is one part of the title of the project, but also towards human flourishing. So to make the link back to the book, to Disordered Minds, it's really the conviction, my conviction at the beginning of the project was that, as I say, it's not just a simple matter of having mental health checks for individuals who want to run for power, but that there's something deeply structural in each of these social institutions. That means that individuals with the characteristics that Sandy had mentioned, of extreme narcissism, paranoia, propensity towards violence, hypermasculinity, there's something deeply structural within each of these social institutions. That means that this type of individual will readily climb the ladder to power. And so that's again, as I said, the premises behind the beginning of the project. It's quite a daunting challenge. And when we started, it was, there's a number of metaphors now that are quickly becoming politically incorrect, such as boiling the ocean. But at the beginning, we were thinking, how do you conceptualize something like this? Because you're really talking about rethinking. We've come to use the word civilization. It's a civilizational transition. When you look at deep fundamental change simultaneous change across all of these social institutions. So how do we even begin to think about that type of holistic civilizational change? And so over this past number of years, we've developed what is a framing. We call it a generative framework, which means that we have 4 sides to this frame, which I'll explain now. But it's not meant to be determinative. It's not meant to give an answer. Instead, it's meant to reframe the way that we think about the individual crises that we're in and the totality collective polycrisis that we're in. And it's meant to invite people to think about these four sides of the frame that I mentioned, and to bring your own perspective, your own thinking on what these aspects of our current thinking are. And also it's meant to be a way of trying to get us out, shift us from a current way that we think, sort of paradigm thinking, to shift us out of those paradigms and help us rethink, reimagine deeply how our social institutions may be organized, how our civilization may be reconfigured. So I'll briefly explain now the four sides to this, as I call it. We call it this generative framing, generative framework. And so if you think of four sides of a picture frame, we have four sides to it, and I'll explain each one of them. So the top level of the picture frame, if you like, we call evolving narratives. And it's really asking, what is the narrative of the transformation that we need to go through? And as I mentioned, the group that I'm part of was an engineering group, a technology group, and the dominant narrative for the transformation, particularly when it comes to climate change, the dominant narrative is of technological change. So you can see that in the COP climate negotiations. It's all about technology. It's all about the transformation to non-fossil fuel energy sources, to electric vehicles, to non-meat diets, and so forth. So it's about, and even in that non-meat diet, it's technology. It's about, ways of growing meat, and that is it's about technologies that will reduce emissions from cows by So even on the food side, it's technology based. Yeah. So the dominant narrative for what is the narrative of transformation is a technological narrative, a narrative of technological change. It's actually a very comforting narrative because it largely means we don't have to change very much. We can keep pretty much our values and the ways that we're living, and technology will solve it. The phrase we use for that is techno-optimism. Technology will solve it for us. Yeah. But in the second half, I'd like to invite you to think about, we have different ideas about what that narrative of transformation is. It's not simply going to be a technological transformation. It's also going to be a transformation about the values that we live by. And we talk about things like hierarchy, about dominance, about competition. So the values, if you like, of modernity, that competition, free markets, the hierarchy and so forth. It's also a transformation of those kinds of values. And one of the things I want to talk about in the second part then is it also a transformation of the myths that we live by? And I'll come back to that. Yeah. The second part of the framing is, we call it ethical guidance, ethical guidelines. And that's really prompted by the fact that when you're in this, anytime that historically we've been in this kind of deep transformation, that deeply unsettling social transformation, many times it hasn't gone well. You only have to think of the characters that I mentioned earlier in terms of Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao and so forth. Whenever there's this level of social dislocation and transformation, the types of characters that I wrote about in Disordered Minds tend to come to the surface. They tend to achieve power. And therefore having ethical guidelines, ethical guardrails in order to keep the translation within, we say is extremely important. The other two parts of the framing, if you take the right-hand side of the frame, that's dynamics of transformation. And it's really asking us to think about, what are the dynamics going to be? What type of transformation are we talking about in terms of the dynamics? And there's a lot of literature on this in terms of technological transformation, because there's a lot about scaling up of technologies, how you can break through an existing paradigm of fossil fuel-based technologies, how that can be brought about, the timescales that can happen in terms of decades. If you phase out fossil fuels over decades and you phase in non-fossil fuel energy and so forth. So there's a lot, and there's metaphors again, are quite technological, about tipping points. You reach a certain level and then there's tipping points, or it's fast diffusion. Again, they're scientific and technological terms. And the dynamics of transformation are seen in that scientific, technological way. But if this is a different narrative, if it's a narrative of values change, if it's a narrative of reducing hierarchies, of decreasing inequalities, if it's a narrative of mythological change, of the myths that we live by, the question then is that this framework invites us, what's the dynamics of change that's happened there? What timescales are we talking about? How does it happen? How does a mythological change, if you want to talk about it in that time, how do we envisage that happening? Who are the agents of that change? So that's the third side of the framing. And then the left-hand side of the framing, if you like, is ways of seeing. And again, this very, very much overlaps with the work that you're doing in terms of mythology. So the ways of seeing, there's a concept that one of our colleagues from Germany, in New Institute in Hamburg, he had written a book called Taming the Big Green Elephant. Ariel Hernandez is his name. And he'd written a book called Taming the Big Green Elephant, which was addressing this challenge that I mentioned earlier about how do you even conceptualize this level of deep civilizational change. And one of the concepts that Ariel mentions in his book is this idea of consensual knowledge. And I think it's a really interesting concept. I'll come on to it again in the second half and look at it a bit more detailed in the second half. But consensual knowledge is really an acknowledgement that the knowledge that particularly policymakers and politicians and so on, but the knowledge that decision makers use to guide their decisions is based on consensus. It's a power game, if you like. Yeah. So the consensual knowledge that's used in economics, for example, excludes a lot of knowledge. Just because something is a fact doesn't mean that it gets into consensual knowledge. Because something's in the consensual knowledge doesn't mean that it's true. So consensual knowledge is the knowledge that the major power stakeholders agree on and then use that to make decision making. But you can think, going back to economics, for example, a lot of ecological economics is excluded. A lot of feminist economics is excluded from economic decision making. And something that's becoming much more prominent now, and even within the mainstream and climate change, is the idea of indigenous knowledge. What is being excluded in terms of indigenous knowledge and knowledge that we have from the deep past that could help us in terms of our guiding this transformation. So that idea of ways of seeing is a kind of an invitation to what is the consensual knowledge, the power, the knowledge based on power that we're currently guiding. What are we leaving out? And how can we look at things differently in terms of reimagining as I said, this civilizational transition. So that framing, those four sides, the sort of what is the narrative of the transformation? What ethical guidelines are we going to have in order to guide it? What's the dynamics of transformation? What timescales? What type of agents are going to be involved? And then the ways of seeing who is being excluded, what ways of thinking are being excluded that we need to bring into the conversation. And so that generative framework, we have just published a paper on this now, just a few weeks ago, actually. But we've been working on that for a number of years. And the idea is to try and use that framing as a means of looking at each of the social institutions that we have in the project. How do you apply that to economics? How do you apply that to gender? How do you apply it to education? How do you apply it to technology with its myths, which we'll come on to, of eternal progress, techno-optimism, and so forth. So it's a kind of a critical rethinking of those social institutions by using that framing. So I don't know how we're doing for timing. Sandy, is that okay to stop there for a break?
Yeah, I mean, we could. Yeah.
Can I
But
ask a question, Sandy, if you wouldn't mind?
sure.
Yeah.
Ian, you haven't mentioned the law
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah.
terms of, so I just wonder, where does the law come in?
I guess it comes in my mind, it comes in politics. Yeah.
Okay.
Because in disordered minds, my framing of democracy was not just, and again, we've written about this, but democracy, as a lot of the ways that we think about it now, is a very, very narrowed down framing of democracy. It's about elections. Yeah. So you vote and you go home, and then 5 years later you go and vote again. Huh? There's a much more expansive interpretation of democracy. And that much more expansive interpretation of democracy, it begins with the idea of decision making. Yeah, that democracy is at root non-violent decision making, a way of non-violently reaching agreement. You vote, if it's majority or whatever way of voting, everyone agrees on that outcome, and it's a non-violent way of making decisions. Historically, that then the law was the next part of that frame, that the layers of democracy that I argue make up the protection against these violent individuals. That non-violent decision making is the first step. The law is the second step, and historically it was the second step. So rules that bind leaders as well as binding, citizens. Yeah. And then the other parts of that, law is part of the other bits of that as well, in terms of the American Revolution had three parts of it, which was the representative democracy, so not just direct democracy, but having representatives who, the separation of powers between different parts of government, and a written constitution, which is law. Yeah. A written constitution that leaders have to abide by and parties have to abide by. And then after the Second World War, the other layers, as I read it in terms of democracy, were international human rights law, which really came out of the Holocaust, that the Nazis were saying it was legal in Germany, it was legal for us to do what we were doing. And therefore the idea that sovereignty isn't absolute. There are international human rights laws that bind every nation, regardless of their own individual national law. And the last part of it is shared sovereignty, which has gone furthest within the European Union. So those sort of different aspects of this much broader interpretation of democracy can be thought of, to my mind, as different ways of keeping these dangerous leaders out of power, and if they get into power, of removing them, having constraints on them. And I think we've seen that with Trump in his first term, the way that the Constitution and the other parts of human rights law and so on sort of constrained him from what he really wanted to be doing. Those constraints are going to be much, much weaker if he gets back in again in November.
Well, exactly. And the way he filled the Supreme Court,
Great, Sandy. Thank you. The second part I'm going to have, it's a looser set of ideas. And again, it's generative. So it's to get your ideas as well. But I'm going to talk about a number of ideas. Yeah. When we start looking at these social institutions, as I said in the first part, and we look at whether it's politics, whether it's economics, whether it's gender, whether it's religion, yeah, we see that there are commonalities to each of these social institutions. And there's an idea that we draw upon by the philosopher Alain Badiou. It's a French philosopher. And he talks about the idea as the Neolithic. Yeah. And for him, the Neolithic is the template for the civilization, the type of civilizations, type of social organizations that humanity has been living within since we first came together in large groups. Yeah. So since agriculture and since the beginning of mass settlements, Badiou argues that we've lived in this structure that he calls the Neolithic. And the Neolithic is essentially a pyramidal structure. It's a hierarchical pyramidal structure. And in that social structure, you have the mass of wealth and power is concentrated in a relatively small elite. Yeah. In the center of the pyramid, you've got a middle class who have been co-opted into the system because they're gaining enough from it. Yeah. They have to acquiesce to the greater power and greater wealth of the elite, but there's enough in it for them to do so because they're the middle part of the pyramid is benefiting significantly to do so. But then at the bottom of the pyramid, which for most of history has been the majority of humanity, are disenfranchised, exploited, and their lives are spent working to maintain the lifestyles of those above them. And so Baidu talks about the Neolithic as being essentially the template that we've lived in since the beginning of written history. And so the people at the top of the pyramid have changed in terms of the names. You know, they're from pharaohs to sultans to monarchs to presidents and prime ministers. Yeah. The ideologies that have maintained the structure have changed from theocracy, you know, to currently to democracy, liberal democracy. Yeah. But essentially the structure has remained the same. And so, Tom, when you're saying, I absolutely agree with you, when you're saying this is such a monumental thing to try and change, because the transformation that I talked about in the first part, if you think about it in these terms, it's for the first time in our history, we're trying to escape from the social template that we've lived under up until now. And just to talk about a few other aspects of that structure, in the breakout group, we were talking about things like, you know, the female being excluded. That's also part of the template of the Neolithic. The elites are hypermasculine males, and things like care and femininity, whether classical femininity, whether that's traits within men or women. Yeah, the idea of gender binary, that those things have to be separated, and men can't, you know, act in ways that are caring or empathic and so forth. And especially for leadership positions, you know, the myth of redemptive violence, which is everywhere, particularly, you know, Hollywood is based on it. Yeah, cartoons are based on it. The myth that, you know, violence will make things good in the end. So the good guy acts with violence against the bad guy, and all is redeemed. That's part of the structural basis of the Neolithic. So these are some of the things that, that in terms of when we think about transformation in the project, we are thinking about it in those terms. This is an historical challenge for us in the face of the polycrisis. And again, as you say, Tom, I think what has changed now is that climate change is an absolute stop that hasn't been there historically for us before. So now the challenge is you either solve this, you get out of the Neolithic, or else this is going to destroy you. So I think historically we're in a very different place than we were in previous attempts to escape from the Neolithic. And Baidu talks about two, actually. He talks about two previous attempts to escape the Neolithic. And one of them, he said, was early Christianity, and particularly St. Paul. Baidu has written a book about St. Paul. And he argues that St. Paul's interpretation of Jesus, in saying that every individual has both the human and the divine, was a call for fundamental, radical equality. That you couldn't treat others in terms of exploitation and in terms of inequality if everyone has part of them that's part of the divine. So the first attempt to escape the Neolithic was early Christianity, which was then co-opted into, helping empires and nation states justify violence and inequality. So that didn't turn out too well. It's still, and this is part of what we talk about when we're looking at religion, because there still is very much a strand within that is still trying to escape the Neolithic. And a lot of people who work in religious organizations are working to try and escape the Neolithic. Maybe not the hierarchy, but a lot of people in these organizations are. The second attempt to escape the Neolithic, Baidu, he calls himself a communist, and he says that communism, 20th century communism, was the second historical attempt to escape the Neolithic. And my interpretation of this was that was doomed to failure from the very beginning by the fact that it adopted violence as its means of escape, because that will simply empower the types of characters and narcissistic, violent, hypermasculine individuals who are at the top of the pyramid and who are responsible for keeping the whole thing in place. So I think communism was doomed to failure because of its adoption of violence as its means of trying to achieve it. So I'd like to say a little bit now about coming on to the theme of transformation as being a transformation of the myths that we live by. So I've mentioned a couple of them there in terms of sort of foundational myths of the Neolithic and of modernity as well, coming forward in history. The myth of redemptive violence, that violence will help us get to where, in terms of achieve justice and so forth, is one. But I think this is where, and this is much more recent in my own thinking, the idea of consensual knowledge that I mentioned in the first part as being this power game, and it's some things are admitted into that and others are excluded. There's an even more fundamental way of thinking about knowledge as being itself largely myth. My initial training was in physics. And something that I took from physics, and again, I went into physics because it was much easier to understand than what was going on in Northern Ireland in terms of how people were interacting with one another. So physics was dead simple. But the idea that a lot of the social institutions, in fact, if you look at all of these social institutions, that they're based largely on myth in the sense of falsity. And I know that's not the definition of myth that you are looking at and your work is based on. But a lot of the myths of social institutions, you could argue, are based on myths that are falsity, or myths that we live by that are actually very fragile. And so one example of this, David McWilliams, who is an economist here in Ireland, has just written a book about money, the history of money. And one of the things that comes out of that book very strongly is that money is based on trust. It used to be based on the gold standard. It used to be based on something that was tangible. So the amount of gold was what you tied your currency to. But in a number of decades ago, that link was broken, and money is now based on the trust that people have that the central bank that issues it will be able to redeem it. But that trust is being undermined decade after decade, from financial crisis to the response to COVID and so forth, in terms of the response to the financial crisis. So the entire economic edifice in a way is based on trust. And you could go forward in each of the other social institutions that they're similarly based on kind of fragile mythologies, if you like, and that's we can talk about whether that's in a negative, or because they are also the things that bind these social institutions, that keep them in place. If people lost faith in them, they would disintegrate. And I think one of the characteristics of the time that we're now living in is that a lot of those myths are collapsing. People's faith in politics, people's faith in politicians, people's faith that democracy will deliver, is collapsing. People's faith in the economy is, because of the levels of inequality on the one hand that it's driving, is collapsing. So you could look at this transformation and the moment that we're in as being that people are losing faith in all these social institutions are failing. That was actually one of the points that we started in the project. We said that we need to look at this, fundamentally look at each of these social institutions, because they're failing in two respects. They're failing, first of all, because they're causing the crisis, all of these crises that we mentioned in terms of polycrisis. And the second is that they're failing because in their current configurations, they're not going to be able to resolve them. So that's, it's a looser set of ideas that I'm talking about in the second half. So I'm interested in your responses to it. But the first idea is this idea of the Neolithic, that we need to escape from this hierarchy and the myths that keep it intact. And the second is that within each of these social institutions, there's a faith that has been there that has kept them, but that faith in those institutions is now collapsing. There's one other idea that I want to introduce, and then I've got two questions. Yeah. So the other idea I want to introduce is, this struck me very forcefully here in Ireland. Other countries may have had different experiences, but it's the idea that alongside this Neolithic structure within our social organization, hierarchies that work on competition, that are based on monetary exchange, that are based on the selfish individual who's profit maximizing and so forth. Alongside that hierarchical structure, there is also, you could argue, an even more fundamental and important structure, which has different names, but one of the names for it is the gift society. Yeah. It's a networked society. It's a networked social organization that doesn't work on those values of competition and monetary exchange. It works on relationships. It works on gift exchange, where we do things for one another because we reciprocate on it, because it's part of, yeah. And that fundamental, it's based much more on care for one another, yeah, much more in values of cooperation. And there's a term that we're using in the project, and it's one of the things that we have to dig much deeper into. But we say that this gift society is based much more on the sacred ordinary. And the sacred ordinary are those things that we value much more fundamentally. It's the love and friendship. It's things like fun and beauty. Yeah. It's the things that where, if you go to Kant's philosophy in terms of truth and beauty and morality, yeah, it's those type of values which are really the fundamentals of how our humanity, it's the context within which we grow as infants. It's the context within which we develop as adults. And that gift society, that networked society, always lives alongside the Neolithic. And so the transformation in those terms can be thought of as a transformation of power from the agents who are holding the Neolithic in place to power being transferred to this much more gift-oriented, sacred, ordinary society. I guess the two questions that I have then are in terms of myth, in the sense that you talk about it, in much more, that myth reflects much more fundamental realities. It's not about falseness, it's about much more, yeah, reflecting much deeper reality. And I guess the two questions are, one of them is out of experience of talking about this at times, yeah, because one of the things about the generative framework is that it forces us to face up to the depth of the pathology within which we're currently living. Yeah. And that's not easy. This is very, very much like psychoanalysis as well. Right? We can't make progress unless we look into the depth of the pathology that we're living in. But very often when we do that, we escape to utopia. We escape to, yeah, things are much better and they aren't as bad. And I work in policy circles. I know this, to get policymakers to think that things aren't as good as politicians say they are is extremely difficult. So one of the questions I have is, what myths can help facilitate us to look at the depth of our pathology, not escape into utopia, but remain there to do the work that we need to do in the transformation of each of these social institutions. And then the second thing is, what myths can help us facilitate this transformation in terms of what, I'm not going to use the word destination, because I don't think we think of the transformation in terms of a linear journey towards a destination. But what myths can facilitate us or help us to make that journey? So there's the two sides to that. One of them is facing the pathology and maintaining hope. and the second is what myths can help us to move forward on the journey.